Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm Mark on RC 74. I'm really proud to show you RC Scrappy finally standing on its wheels. So double wishbone suspension at the front and tail wheel suspension for the tail wheel is all finished, and I will show you all the details in today's video on the final steps on the tail wheel suspension, and also the installation of harder springs to finally make it possible to get RC Scrappy on its wheels. So let's jump right into the build steps and have a closer look to the details. As a shock absorber for the tail suspension, I used the same kind of shock absorbers like on the front suspension. It's from Kingkong RC. The only difference is that the front shock absorber are 105 millimeters from hole to hole, and the tail wheel shock absorber is only 70 millimeters from hole to hole. The reason is pretty simple. As you can see, I'm already pretty close to the horizontal stabilizer with the mount hole in the fuselage with the 70 millimeter shock absorber. So this is the reason why I chose a shorter shock absorber in comparison to full-scale Scrappy, which has the same shock absorbers all around the plane. When the tail wheel shock absorbers arrived, I figured out that the shock absorbers are actually completely disassemblable. The reason why I didn't completely disassemble the front shock absorbers to remove the paint from the red tube is that the heads on the top side are tightened up like crazy from factory, and I wasn't able to take apart the shock absorber ends from the rods. But when I saw on the rear shock absorbers that they actually are disassemblable because they were not tightened up like the front ones, then I was brave enough to take apart all the shocks and remove the paint completely. The travel range of the front shock absorbers is around 3 centimeters, and on the tail it is around 1.5 centimeters with stock spring, but the stock spring is way too soft, so with a harder spring with thicker wire it will be a bit less, so I think around 1.2 centimeters or something like that. Then I started with the final steps on the trailing arm. First I had to remove the carbon rod, which is glued into the foam inside the trailing arm. Just to make it possible to work on the holes, I had to drill into the trailing arm. Then I cut the trailing arm ends to the right length, sanded them down with 150 grit sandpaper to get smooth ends, and removed all the epoxy residue from both ends which run into the open ends of the trailing arm. Then I took a 10mm drill and drilled a hole into the foam inside the trailing arm. The reason for this is that I wanted to remove the whole XPS foam which I used for the template to wrap the whole carbon layers around the foam. I wanted to remove this foam, so the hole helped to put in some thinner to remove the whole foam. So the foam kind of melts and it's only a tiny bit of foam inside, and you can clean out the whole foam, and then you have a perfectly clean hollow carbon part after removing the foam with thinner. Then I masked the trailing arm with tape and marked the hole spots I needed for the pivot point on the fuselage, pivot point for the shock absorber, and also the big hole on top of the trailing arm to install the shock absorber into the trailing arm. To get more precise drilled holes, I used the L to push some tiny holes into the marked spots for the holes, then drilled the 3mm hole in 3 steps, first 1mm, then 2, then 3mm, to get as centered as possible. But unfortunately the holes weren't perfectly lined up from side to side, so I had to correct 2 of the holes to make the rods sit really perfectly leveled in the arm. For this I took a file, sanded out the holes, made them a little bigger, and like this the rods actually fit perfectly leveled. Then I drilled and sanded the big hole for the shock absorber. This is around 12 millimeters of diameter, and the shock fits perfect in this hole. This hole also helps me to screw on the wheel adapter, because I had to put in the nuts from inside the trailing arm, and that made it way easier to do the installation on the wheel adapter. Then I did the first installation of the tail adapter on the trailing arm, just to check the position and if it's all straight and perfectly lined up, and it all looked good. Then I prepared the brass tubes, which take the steel rods inside the trailing arm. I sanded the surface to get better grip with gluing them in with epoxy, then cut them into the right length, sanded them a bit to make the ends smooth. I kept them a little too long, just to make it easier to work with the epoxy without getting epoxy into the brass tubes. I also drilled the brass tubes in the diameter up to 2.2 millimeter, just because my hardened steel rods are exactly 2.2 millimeter in diameter, and like this I get a perfect fit, absolutely free of play, so there is no wobbling trailing arm on the final installation. Then I did a short fit check of the tubes in the trailing arm, all looked good. Then I took my 24-hour epoxy and glued the tubes, including a long rod, into the arms. The long rods helped me to get the perfect angle, so I could compare front and rear rod if they are perfectly leveled, 90-degree angle to the trailing arm, so everything is perfectly set up. Then I did the first test installation of the shock absorber into the trailing arm. Was a little bit tricky because it's pretty tight, and I also wanted to have no play of the shock absorber in the trailing arm, so I had to use some shims and O-rings to make a perfect fit without any play, and like this it all was pretty tight to install, but in the end the installation looks pretty clean. Because of the not perfect fit of the drill I did for the brass tubes, I had two big holes, and there I used clear epoxy to fill the gap, but with only clear epoxy you can see the area where you put on the clear epoxy, because you can see through the epoxy and you have no carbon. I decided to give it a try to make black epoxy. For this I sanded down a carbon plate. These are some small parts I don't use anymore. Sanded them down, made a lot of dust, put it into the mixed epoxy, mixed the whole thing up, and so like this I got perfectly black epoxy, and like this I filled up the gaps of the two big holes to make the two big holes invisible. That works surprisingly good, and for this reason I take all my carbon dust and collect it just to have it ready for any upcoming black epoxy glue spots. Next step was to draw the templates for the tail suspension mount, which is completely glued into the fuselage except the small mount area for the pivot point of the trailing arm. For this I took some carton, drawed the templates onto the carton, and masked the carbon plate. It's a 1.5 millimeter carbon plate, and drawed the whole templates onto the plate, cut the raw shape out of the plates, sanded it down to the raw shape. Then I had to drill the two holes to install the trailing arm and the shock absorber. On the trailing arm side I had to drill 2.2 millimeter for the 2.2 millimeter steel rod, and on the shock mount hole there is a M3 screw, so I had to drill a 3 millimeter hole. Then I screwed the two plates together just to get the perfect same shape of both plates when I sand them to the final shape. When you screw them together you can sand two parts at once, and there is no difference in shape Then I did final shaping with Dremel and 150 and 240 sanding paper. I also sanded the upper edges, the long edges of the carbon mounts. I made them kind of sharp, like a knife edge. Like this, the mounts are easier to put into the cut on the fuselage. Then I had to sand down the brass tubes for shock absorber and pivot point to the exact right length. The side of the shock absorber I sanded down to the same level of the trailing arm, and on the trailing arm pivot point I kept it 1 millimeter longer than the trailing arm, so I can avoid touching the carbon mount plate with the trailing arm. Then I did a first assembling of the whole suspension just to check if everything fits together, and the installation looked pretty good. Then it was time to do the preparation of the fuselage to install the carbon mounts. For this I masked the lower side of the fuselage, drawed the exact shape of the cuts I had to do to install the shape, to make the big hole for the shock absorber and the long cuts for the carbon mounts. If you make holes into your fuselage like this makes the fuselage way weaker, so you have to be aware how you design your carbon mount, which keeps the whole fuselage together again. That's also the reason why I made it longer than only to the hole for the shock absorber. There are 2.5 centimeters longer mounts, just because like this you can keep the fuselage rear end and front part of the fuselage together and reinforce this area which was weakened because of drilling this big hole for the shock absorber. Then I cut all the lines with a hobby knife, just 1 centimeter deep for the long area and around 5 centimeter deep for the area for the shock absorber. Did also the cuts which are 90 degrees to the flight direction, cut it all with the same knife. Then took a screwdriver and simply digged out all the foam which was in this area where the shock should be installed. Then I masked the fuselage with tape and drawed the spot where the shock mount hole will be, and sanded out the hole with my Dremel tool just to get perfect access to the screw for the shock installation. This hole will be covered later by the foil I used to wrap the whole plane, and it's also underneath the horizontal stabilizer, so you won't see the hole anymore with the final build. Before I glued the mounts into the fuselage, I sanded the whole surface, which will be glued into the fuselage, just to increase the grip for the 24-hour epoxy I used for this job. Then I glued the plates in, installed the whole suspension just to let the epoxy cure while the whole suspension is installed, so I was able to check the exact right position, so it's perfectly in line with the fuselage. Everything is perfectly set up. After the 24-hour epoxy was cured, I figured out that some epoxy ran over my nut and the screw which installs the shock absorber in the fuselage, and that was a pretty hard work to get the glued in screw and nut out of the fuselage. I had to fight to remove the nut, then try to push out the screw the regular way, but I was only able to push it out for around 1 centimeter out of the fuselage, so I had to cut off the head of the screw and push it the opposite way out of the fuselage. Like this, fortunately I was able to save the whole installation and use the new screw and new nut, and the installation was okay so far. The mistake was that I didn't use some grease to cover the whole nut and the whole screw before adding the epoxy, because if the epoxy runs accidentally over your nut or over your screw, this is glued on perfectly well and you will have a hard time to remove the screw and nut. So always put on enough grease on the nut and on the screw to avoid such situations. Then the whole suspension was ready to do the final step to make it possible to put RC Scrappy on its wheels. I had to replace the way too soft springs on the tail wheel, shock absorber and shock absorber on the main landing gear with the harder springs I already got. These springs are actually way too hard. My hopefully perfectly fitting springs are still on the way. So this is the current progress on RC Scrappy build. I'm really happy with the look so far. The tail wheel works really super smooth with double ball bearing in the pivot point of the tail wheel. So that actually works great. I'm really excited how it will work with taxi the plane on the flying field, because the steering will only be with the rudder, but no help on steering with the wheel because the wheel is spinning free. Same setup like on full scale Scrappy, but I will put a lot of angle on the rudder, so I think this will work also fine for taxiing the plane on the flying field. So this is it for today's video. Thanks a lot for watching. Have a good time. See you in the next one. Bye bye.